Welcome everybody to this recording on case study. We're going to be exploring what case study is broadly as a methodology, but also I hope we're going to be providing lots of examples of how we might use case study to aid us when we're doing research into music education. So I'd like to start with a question, and it's kind of fundamental to what we're looking at, which is what can the intensive study of one thing teach us about other similar experiences? This question is really at the heart of what it means to be doing a case study. From studying one thing in a lot of detail, we might start to be able to think about how that particular example extrapolates and is meaningful in other contexts. So this is kind of core to what it means to be doing a case study, or to the approach we use in case study. So in terms of this video, we're going to start off by looking at what a case study is and also defining what we mean by the word case. Then we're going to start thinking about case study and research questions, because it's really important that we formulate those carefully. Then we'll look at different types of case study. There's not one singular type of case study. There are different approaches, different purposes, and different theorists have had different ways of thinking about case study. And then finally we'll look at strengths, limitations, and how we apply case study. So let's begin with a definition. So a case study is typically understood as a qualitative, and notice that word qualitative when we think about the paradigms that we explored in the last couple of weeks. We had quantitative on one side and a qualitative on the other. This is a qualitative research approach, and it's there for investigating a phenomenon within its real life context. Now, the word phenomenon I know is a little bit complex perhaps, so it's going to come up repeatedly, so I'm going to give a quick definition of it. So a phenomenon is something that happens or exists and can be seen, felt, or studied. So it could be like a rainbow or an earthquake or a new trend. It often refers to something unusual, interesting, or important to the people that notice it and try to understand it. So coming back to case study, often the boundaries between the phenomenon you're going to be studying and the context in which it exists are not clearly evident, and we'll think about this when we're looking at case study in more detail. So a carefully designed case study methodology helps you separate the two out. If we think about what we discussed in the previous sessions, and we're talking about scientists looking at a very small detail, there's something similar going on with case study. We need to separate some things out, but also because we're looking at that context, it's going to be rich, it's going to be complex, and actually picking up on that detail is really important as well. It's important to grasp that if we're thinking about case study, it's not really just about data collection. Sometimes if you look at educational research books, they'll describe case study as a way of collecting data. In the way that I'm approaching it with you today, we're talking about it as a methodology, and that means that it's like an underpinning approach. So it's not just a way of collecting data, it's more philosophical than that. It's a way of understanding how we interact and study reality, really. It's a way of getting to that level of thinking. The last definition I gave you is very closely related to this definition, and this is by the theorist Robert Yin. In this presentation, I'm going to draw on literally just a few people, probably 3 or 4 different theorists. They're the really huge names in qualitative research, and specifically around case study. And Robert Yin's books on case study are really sort of seminal works. So if you're going to do a case study, you probably need to engage with his work. So this is his definition. He defines case study as an empirical inquiry that investigates a contemporary phenomenon in depth and within its real-life context, especially when the boundaries between the phenomenon and its context are not clearly evident. So key here is this notion of empirical. And if you think back to the videos from the last sessions, Empirical was really about grounding our understanding in our sensory evidence as we see it from the real world. It's interesting to note this contemporary idea. It means that it's not a way of studying histories, and typically this isn't done. We tend to think and use case study to study things that are happening now. And then, as we've already discussed, this blurred boundary, and it's important to think about that. So think about the study of improvisation in a culture in a specific jazz ensemble. So the culture and the ensemble themselves are really linked. So if we're going to study that culture, it's really difficult to separate these things out, but we're going to try to do that as much as we can. But those areas are going to be blurred. The context and the phenomena are linked. Very often they're one and the same thing. So another key theorist here is John Creswell, and again a really huge name in qualitative research generally, but has written a lot about case study. So he describes it as a type of design in qualitative research, and again note that qualitative, it's not quantitative, in which the investigator explores a real-life contemporary bounded system, a case. Now, there are a few different bits and pieces there we probably need to break down. We talked about the idea of it being contemporary. The real life is important here. It's something that's actually happening. And then the word bounded, we'll come back to that word, but note that word bounded because it's really important. Moving on in the description. So he says, through detailed, in-depth data collection involving multiple sources of information. Again, there's lots here. Detailed is really super important. When we're doing case study, it's rich data. We're trying to get as much of the detail and the small details as possible. This in-depth stresses that further, I guess. Multiple sources of information is also critical. A word which comes up and will come up repeatedly is the notion of triangulation. Now, triangulation sounds like it should mean three. Triangulation could be 2 different sources of data, or it could be 10 different sources of data. The important thing here, though, is that we try to have multiple sources. So we look at something, a phenomenon, a case, from different perspectives. So we might talk to learners, we might talk to teachers, we might talk to parents, and they would all give us different types of data. They'd have different perspectives. Similarly, we might draw upon a survey, or we might draw upon an interview or an observation, and those are also different types of data. Whatever those sources are, we're going to hopefully try to get more than one source. So we've got a sense, hopefully, of what a case study is. But if it's a study of a case, what is the case itself? How do we describe what a case is? So there are 3 different things that we might think about. The first, as we've talked about, is a bounded system, and this is really important. If we're studying something, we need to say what it is and where it is and bound it. It's not everything. It's not the whole world. It's a small space. And bounded, as I say, is a word that's going to keep on coming back. We'll talk about this a bit later as well. Next, it's defined by its parameters, which typically include time, place, and the participants involved. So this is that kind of context. Again, it's helping to set those boundaries. We're saying it's not all learners, it's learners who are between the ages of 7 and 10, let's say. Or it's not all learners, it's specifically about Singapore and learners in Singapore. These kind of things are really important. And if we think about it, if we were doing a case study of instrumental learning, imagine one where we're looking at kindergarten children and then one with 11-year-olds. We're going to have really completely different data. So it's why bounding it and defining what it is so important. Thirdly, it's centered around a phenomenon of interest. So this is the specific issue or process or event that you're investigating within those boundaries. So it could be that we're studying music learning in a kindergarten, but specifically we're looking at something to do with the use of notation, let's say, or it could be singing and specifically pitch within kindergarten singing. So we're looking at a specific phenomenon, something of interest. So let's break this down into some really tangible examples. So we're talking less sort of theoretically and more grounded in reality. So here's an example, thinking about beginner flautists. So these are young children perhaps who are learning to play. You'll see that we've got our case, we know what that is. We're looking specifically at flautists, not guitarists, and they're not experienced. So we're bounding our research. Then we're going to set our parameters. Again, this context is important. We're saying when it is. So it's kind of in the last year is when we're doing this particular research. The place, it's not in Singapore. It's not in Mexico. It's in the south of England. We're being very specific because actually our findings in the south of England could be different to the southwest of England or the north of England. We're trying to be as specific as we can, and probably if we were writing this up, we'd go into even more details specifically about what those children are like. Is this context an urban context? Are the students typically middle class? What's their socio-economic background? We could start talking about things like gender. So there's a whole range of different things that we might want to define there. And then if we think about the phenomenon itself, what we could be looking at here is early stage musical skill acquisition, and particularly around motivation in young learners. So we're defining that. We're not looking at everything to do with their learning, we're specifically looking at their motivation. Got a second example here, just thinking about exactly again how we define this case study. So this one's slightly different. We're thinking about year 12 students in a UK school. Again, we're setting those dimensions around this. We're being very specific if we look at the parameters. We're saying when this is happening. Okay, it's the coming academic year. We're looking at 2 particular schools, important, so it's not 12. We're saying how many, and we're setting that. It's really important that we're honest about the parameters we're working with, and they're in Manchester. And we're also being specific about the students. We're saying there are 5 students and there are 2 teachers. And probably what we would do if we were really doing this is we would further define that. So perhaps it's 1 teacher with 1 student or 4 teachers with the other, or quite what that breakdown is. Perhaps one of those teachers is moving between 2 schools and teaches in both. We need to be precise. It's very important. And our phenomenon could be something like transition from GCSE to A-level music. And particularly our phenomenon would be a shift in musical identity, confidence and analytical thinking. So we're really trying to nail down what it is that we're studying. It's not there particularly whether they like Mozart or if they prefer romantic music. We're looking particularly at their musical identity, which might be related to those other things, but we're looking at it from that particular perspective, that particular phenomenon. Okay, so just returning to these, again, you'll notice I'm talking about the same thing over and over, but I'm really trying to stress the point so you understand it. This bounded system, so we've got to have those clearly defined limits. It's not about every learner in every context. It's not about children learning guitar being the same as children learning trumpet. We're saying they're learning these things. I mean, obviously we might look at learners across different instruments, all brass instruments, but we want to be as specific as we can be. The next is that it's in depth, and as we've already talked about, it's multiple sources of data like interviews or observations, and they're coming probably from different groups, different people. And the third thing is this real world context. We're looking at a phenomenon and it's studied where it naturally occurs. And it's really important if we think about a positivist approach to research, that's typically done in a place like a laboratory where we're separating out all of the different things. If you remember the example of the test tube, we've got chemical A, chemical B, we mix them together and then we get chemical C, the reaction. This is not that. This is messy. It's in a real world situation. We could be studying something and seeing a very strong pattern forming, then all of a sudden it's a windy day, or perhaps one of the children in a class comes in and they've had some issue at home the day before and everything suddenly blows up. So that messiness is important. We're not denying it. We're not avoiding it, and we're definitely not writing it out of our research, instead of which we're looking at that thickness, that rich detail. And it means that case studies are very often contradictory. We'll see something happen here that suggests A, and then something over here will happen, it will suggest B, because there are so many different parameters going on in any situation that what we're trying to do is explain it. We're trying to analyze and get to the depth of that, rather than deny that it's a complex setting. One of the things that you'll have to do when you're framing your research is to arrive at a research question, and the question itself will define the type of research approach that you take. Some things we can answer with one approach, and we just simply can answer it with a different research approach. In terms of case study, it's really ideally suited to understand complex phenomenon, and it gets us towards asking questions very often of how or why. But we need to think about it, even with something like a how question. It's not how many. It's not about frequency. We're looking at the rich data of how does something happen. If we come to Yin, this is directly from him. In general, case studies are preferred methods when a how or why question is being posed. So this is because these questions are going to demand complex answers and explanations. They're often going to be messy, and they're often going to be rich. Very often it's not a unilinear, what we might describe as a unilinear causal effect. It's not just one thing happening and causing something else to happen over here. There are multiple things going in, and there are multiple impacts coming out the other side. It's messy. And how and why questions are going to get into that kind of messiness, that detail, that complexity. Let's have a look at 4 questions, 2 which are suited, 2 which are unsuited. So we could ask questions like, how did music teachers manage recent GCSE curriculum changes? You see, that's a how question. There might not be one simple answer to that. It might be different for different teachers. We might be able to draw together key themes that arise from our investigation. I just want to raise one thing quickly. These questions might not be perfect, and if I was going to reframe them, I might choose them slightly differently or reset them. But as useful examples for what we're exploring here, I've set them up in that way. If I was teaching you and looking at research questions particularly, we might start attacking these questions for various reasons, but we'll come on to that as we progress through the program. Let's look at the second one. So this is a why question. Why do peripatetic music teachers value improvisation with their students? So again, we can see we could investigate this. We could talk to the teachers themselves. We might talk to the students. We could even start exploring wider data around this, perhaps looking at observations of lessons and seeing improvisation and the teacher-student response and relationship and things like that. So there are different ways we could study those questions to answer them. Let's look at kind of questions which we couldn't answer with a case study. So here's one. So how many music schools in the UK use method X? It's not the kind of thing which we could study with a case study. It's not set up for it. If we used a survey, we could post out things to lots of schools and get a simple answer back. But it's not that rich data which we're looking through or for through a case study. Similarly, something like what's the income of a freelance musician? We're not going to be able to answer that with a case study. It's the wrong kind of question. We'd need to collect quantitative data, and that's not. We can sometimes have quant data in a case study, but typically we don't. Typically we're going to be using qualitative, rich data, interviews, observations, things like that. Okay, let's break down case study because it's not a singular thing. There are different perspectives, and if we look at different theorists, and these are 2 key theorists, we've got Robert Stake and Robert Yin, they themselves come to case studies from somewhat different perspectives. So Robert Stake is very much grounded in the idea of a case study being a qualitative approach. And he distinguishes very importantly between intrinsic, the interest in the case itself, and instrumental, cases that understand or help us to understand a broad range of issues. But importantly here, he's thinking about this in terms of very rich data. For Yin, however, if you read his book, you're going to see there are lots of diagrams, flow diagrams, and he's really keen on thinking about the data that you collect and how you move that through logical processes to find understandings. He really emphasizes protocol rigor, generalizability, and the development of theory. It's really strong in his work. So if you've kind of got a bit of a mathematical mind and you're like, actually, I'd like to do quant type work, but it doesn't really suit the question I'm answering or looking at. If you go to Robert Yin's work, he's really good because you'll follow a whole load of very logical processes, which are almost pseudo-mathematical in a way. It's a nice way of thinking about it. Whereas if actually you're really into thinking about meaning of things, very qualitative, this idea of lived experience, those types of things, then you might well lean more towards Robert Stake's approach. So flushing this out a little bit further, we might want to start thinking about the purpose and the focus of a case study, because we might be doing a case study for slightly different reasons, and we'll look at some of those and how we might structure the case study differently depending upon why we want to do the case study in the first place. So this is Yin's work, and he describes 3 different reasons or purposes why we might have a case study. For instance, he describes exploratory. So this might be something where there's very little known about a particular phenomenon. And so we're going to be one of the first people here where we're actually really trying to understand it and explore it more broadly. We might get into a descriptive case study, and we're trying to get into the really rich detail. This is not superficial. This is not a basic understanding. This is like really getting in deep and really trying to work out what is happening here. What are all the different elements, all the different moving parts? And then finally, we get into explanatory. Now, this is really particularly picking up on Yin's work. As I said, he's kind of almost pseudo-mathematical in a way. And he creates logical processes through which you can quite literally get to a point where you can start to develop arguments which would lead you to causal relationships, cause and effect. And he defines that as an explanatory case study. So we might do it for one of these 3 different reasons or purposes. Another way that we might want to come to this is by thinking about how we imagine the case, and is it a single case or is it multiple cases that we're looking at? So we have the phenomenon, we have the case, the bounding, and we might want to choose either to look at one particular case or to look at 2 or more. If we look at one, we're going to have a single case study. So this is very often a very in-depth thing, where we're looking at that specific phenomenon. For instance, let's have a study where we're looking at one year 12 music class, and we're looking at what's happening with those students in particular. Or we might choose to have a multiple case study. It means we're going to have multiple cases, multiple of those bounded things happening around us. And we're going to be looking then at similarities and differences between the cases themselves. One reason to do this is to enhance robustness and thinking about replication and generalizability. So an example might be that we're going to actually look at 3 different brass programs in different locations. We're going to be able to see how the motivational strategies are different in those 3 different locations. And we can look at first one, essentially a single case study, and then we can get to compare that with the second one, and then finally with a third one, and we're starting then to build up a body of information, of data, and we might start to compare and contrast whatever similarities, whatever differences. So we see that a multiple case study gives us that broader plateau to explore. A single case is obviously less generalizable, but more simple to undertake and can still have a real richness about it. These link quite nicely to thinking about holistic and embedded approaches. Again, this is coming from Yin's work. So in a holistic approach, it's going to treat the case as single, indivisible unit of analysis. So we might, for instance, explore the entire culture of a music department. There might be smaller parts to this, but we're looking at it holistically. We're not going to deliberately chop it into small pieces. Whereas if we're looking at an embedded design, we are deliberately going to try to break that into smaller units of analysis. So for instance, if we're studying a music program as the main case, we could separate it out into a multiple nested phenomenon. So we might look at student experience on one side. We might think about parental engagement and involvement on another. We could be looking at teaching strategies. Each of those is a separate phenomenon, a separate thing that we're going to study, and then we bring these together. You're going to see that obviously if we're doing an embedded case study, that's a lot more complex. And it might be something particularly as we move towards you actually doing your research, it might be a bit more sophisticated. It's possibly something that you might want to leave until if you're thinking about doing doctoral research. So it might be that you start off with a single case study and treat something holistically, get to grips, learn how to use these processes, and then through doing that in your actual research, you might be ready to go and take on a slightly more complex process. So moving on from simply thinking about how we subdivide our case studies up, we might also want to think about actually what the case is. What's it a case of? And here again, we've got some references to Yin, who defines 4 different types of case. I'm not going to get into them in much detail, but you'll note that some are kind of typical things. Some might be challenging theory. So we might have something where we think, actually, there's a theory here and we can see it from a different perspective. A good example of that might be, let's say that you've got a theory which is emerging from the West, let's say from American or European theorists. And perhaps you're a student who's studying in China. Perhaps you might take a critical approach and see if this actually is going to stand up, this theory stands up in your space. We also have kind of revelatory of unique or extreme cases, which is where we're starting to explore phenomena which are harder to get to grips with for various reasons. Okay, another way of flipping this around and thinking about this is thinking about what we're actually doing. Are we building theory, which is typical, and again we can link this back to inductive and deductive thinking to some extent. So building theory means that we're going to be using our case study to generate theory. So we're not going to start with a hypothesis. We're not going to start with an idea, really a very closed idea of what it is that we're expecting to see. Rather, we're going to collect data, and through the collection of that data, we're going to start to develop a theory about how a certain phenomenon is enacted and is manifest. However, the other way of doing this is more of a deductive approach, where we start off with a theory. Perhaps we've got a paper that somebody else has given us, and we're going to test it ourselves. We're going to go, actually, does this theory hold true in this other real world context? So we can start from either end. Sometimes we even have a little bit of a to and fro here between these places. Okay, you're going to discover this as we go through the program as well, which is that there is no perfect methodology. Everything that we can do has weaknesses and limitations, and it's really important that we recognize what those are, because if we ignore them, then all of our research is going to be unbalanced and biased potentially. So let's think about what some of these are. Well, clearly, because we're looking at a particular context, we're going to have issues around generalizability here. If we're looking at one school, it's not clear that another second school is going to be having exactly the same issues, or the same phenomenon will arise, or the outcome of our understanding of that phenomenon would be the same in the other school. So we need to be aware of that. Another thing is researcher bias, which is going to be in all qualitative data and all qualitative research, perhaps more importantly. What do we collect? How and why are we collecting it? How and why are we viewing it as being important? Even why do we want to choose the research question we're choosing? So we need to be really aware of that, and we need to be honest about it. Very often people will be talking about their positionality at the beginning of their research. This is something that affected me personally as a learner. That's why I want to research it. And through that process, they're saying, and they will actually say explicitly, well, this is my bias because this is how it affected me. So I need to be aware that, am I looking to confirm what I believe about myself, or am I looking to challenge it, or what am I looking to do? It's also a reason for the triangulation. If you remember, we talked about that, where you have more than one data source, why that's important. And then another one, and we'll talk about this more later in the course. If you're doing lots of observations, lots of interviews with various different people, very often you can get huge data, and this becomes exponential. It's not just the time it takes to notate those interviews or write up fully your observations, and increasingly we've got tools that can save us a lot of time with that, which is great. But we're now starting to get lots of different data, and what happens when we're trying to compare interview A to interview B is fairly straightforward, but all of a sudden multiply that to 10 interviews and you start to see how this becomes exceptionally complex. So this is something we're going to need to think about. And one of the things that I say very often to students is to keep what you're studying very small. And it sounds silly, and a lot of people want to chew off a lot. I'm going to study 10 schools, and how can I make this generalizable unless I'm studying a lot? But actually, you won't be able to do it to a good level of detail if you do a huge thing. You'd be far better off studying something with a very small pool of people, let's say 3 or 5 participants in your research. You'll get far more data if you're studying that in a very rich and deep way. Then that kind of level, that kind of scope is probably perfect. Okay, and just to wrap up then, these are some key books. These are the key names. You'll see I've talked about these 3 people, Creswell, Stake and Yin. Go away, have a look at what they've written. If you're interested particularly in doing case study, you need to engage with their work, your bibliography, your lit review. Really needs to draw on their thinking in terms of your methodology. They come to these things from very kind of different perspectives. So you need to be aware of that, and you need to start thinking about how you align with them, which elements of each one of these theorists you really like to pick up on and use and utilize, and why you'd like to do that. Anyway, I hope that's been interesting, and I shall see you in the next video next week. What I'd like you to do before then is, and this will be on Moodle, I would like you to go away and I'd like you to find specifically a case study around music education. Find something that you think will be a study that you might be related to something that you could do or you might want to do. And then I want you to break it down, think about the slides that we've just had, and really reflect on that case study and how it aligns with the things we've discussed. Anyway, I shall see you in the next video. You all take care, and I shall see you all soon.